All right, and we are back and joined by Webster Griffin Tarpley. He is a historian, economist, journalist, lecturer, and noted critic of U.S. foreign and domestic policy. You can find his work on tarpley.net. He's also a great Twitter follow, by the way. His Twitter handle is @WebsterGTarpley. You know, he tweets all of his ideas, and I mean, really, you get a real up-to-date view on things that are going on in the world that may not be on his website currently. So, welcome to the show, Webster.
Thank you so much, Jake. How you doing?
Great. There's a smart guy I know. His name is Ted Torbich, and he correctly called the Israeli-Gaza conflict a prison riot. Because what do prisoners do when they are being abused and denied everything? I mean, they freak out and get violent. I mean, we saw that in Attica over nearby here decades ago. They moved to invade on July 17th, the same day as the MH17 crash, to get cover from the Western media. I mean, it's not even clear what this is about, since the catalyst for this event, the 3 dead Israeli teenagers, turned out to be an unsolved situation. So, I mean, what exactly is this about, Webster?
Well, I think it's less important to puzzle about why Netanyahu is a madman and why a madman does what he does, although we could go into that. I don't think this is the place or time. The main thing is what should be done. Now, it's obvious that the Israeli bombing of the Palestinians in Gaza and these, over 1,000 dead, this is an act of barbarism which has shocked the conscience of the civilized world, and I think it's actually begun to shift the balance that had been stacked so long in favor of the unconditional apologists for Israel. And again, Israel is one thing, the madman Netanyahu is another. I don't think Netanyahu is typical. I'm still thinking about the 1 million-plus Israeli young people who came out for a demonstration a couple of years ago that they had no future, that they were going nowhere, no jobs, no prospects, no standard of living, no way to found a family, have a decent home, raise children, right? All of that taken away by the neocon and neoliberal economics of Netanyahu. He is the architect of the modern Israeli low-wage, no-future economy is Netanyahu. But let's focus a bit on what ought to be done. The first thing is you need an immediate ceasefire. The second thing is you've got to recognize that the root causes of all this are the occupation, and whatever they say, it remains occupied, whether they send in patrols every day or every 2 or 3 years, changes nothing. It is occupied territory, and most dramatically, it is blockaded. It's besieged. There are no ways in or out. People can't come in. People can't come out. Imports, exports are impossible without special procedures. 50 to 60% unemployment. This is simply intolerable in the modern world. So that, I think, has to end. And while you're doing it for Gaza, you've also got to do it for the people in the West Bank, right? The other larger part of the Palestinian territory. Now, Netanyahu, I certainly condemn him. On the other hand, the leadership of Hamas have a certain amount of responsibility for this because of their ineptitude, because of their stupidity and bungling. Haniyeh, in particular, the leader of one of the leaders of the political side of it, has, I think, painted himself into a corner. He endorsed the imperialist attack on Syria, which I think is just despicable. And Haniyeh has managed to maneuver himself into a situation of conflict with Egypt. And I think that is very, very counterproductive. If you're a small country under siege, wedged in between two larger ones, the Israelis on one side and Egypt on the other, it ought to be elementary. You've got to make friends with one of those two. And if you can't make friends with the Israelis, which you can't, you damn well better make friends with the Egyptians. And Haniyeh doesn't seem to have grasped that, right? This is a little bit like well, certain countries in Eastern Europe in the late 1930s, right? Who they didn't like the Soviets, they didn't like Hitler, so they wouldn't choose, and eventually that's untenable. I don't see any reason why you couldn't get along quite well with General Sisi in Egypt. I think he's reasonable. Obviously, what he's going to want is that Hamas stop helping out terrorists that come out of that territory and then carry out terrorist actions in the Sinai Peninsula. Right? That's what he's concerned about. So give him that. Don't let the Palestinian people suffer because Haniyeh insists on supporting his friends. Part of this has got to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Don't ever forget the Muslim Brotherhood is in a worldwide alliance with the CIA and has been for decades. Now, apart from this stuff, it's clear Netanyahu has to go, demagogue and warmonger. He's got to go out the window. But now the other question is what should happen. In order to face this, you've got to have a Middle East peace conference. You've got to have a Geneva conference, and it's got to be attended by all interested parties, from Egypt to Iran, Saudis, Qatar, Emirates, Syria, Russia above all, United States, of course, the principal Europeans, Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, and so on down the line. India, China, probably also. And what should you do with that? You've got to create two countries, two states. They've got to be independent. They've got to be sovereign. They cannot be subjected to constant military intervention from the other side. And that probably means in today's world a peacekeeping force from the United States or other countries, right? Maybe not the United States. Maybe the Cold War formula was Poland and Canada. Maybe today you could do Poland and you could do Canada and Kazakhstan or something like that. In other words, you've got to get the principal power blocks represented. And obviously, you're going to have the 1967 borders with the exception of agreed-on swaps. This means that most of the Israeli settlements will have to be taken back into Israel. I suggest that the settlers, who are oftentimes people who went there because of economic hardship, they need to be compensated. A fund has to be created for that. If there are Palestinians who have lost their homes inside Israel, they also have to be compensated. In other words, there is a right to return, but it's likely that the right to return will be exercised in the form of an indemnity, that you get damages paid, right, so that the right is respected. But at the same time, we don't create situations that are not tenable after so many decades of conflict and hatred. Jerusalem will have to be finessed. The other thing, though, is the main thing. The economic development program, a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. Look at it. Lebanon is devastated since 2006. Syria is now devastated. Iraq is devastated. Gaza, of course, the West Bank, and parts of the Sinai now are also a war zone. Right? Egypt needs a development program. This extends all the way into Somalia and other places. Libya, of course, has descended into utter chaos. So what you're going to need is a Marshall Plan for the entire region, and obviously the principal powers, the U.S., the European Union, Japan ought to be involved, China ought to be involved. The new one on the block, though, is the BRICS Bank, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, at their recent conference in Fortaleza, Brazil, have set up something that I've been hoping for a long time, which is an institutional alternative to the International Monetary Fund. It is the BRICS International or Multilateral Development Bank, and with that money, that would go far towards beginning to rebuild this entire region. And it's got to be a situation where all states benefit. Right now, there is no common interest among them. Only economic development can create a common interest, at least in maintaining the peaceful situation, so that your development investments don't get bombed out of existence in the next war. So I would say those are the things. And obviously, one thing we could do here in the United States is to stop subsidizing this kind of aggression. In other words, you look at this Iron Dome. Well, the Iron Dome was paid for by the U.S. If the Israelis didn't have the Iron Dome, they'd probably have had to negotiate a ceasefire earlier because they couldn't take that punishment. So I think that's indicative of the need to start scaling back or cutting off completely $3.1 billion that the U.S. pays to the Israelis every year. This is in effect the subsidy that allows Netanyahu and people like him to keep being so unreasonable, right? That they're truculent and recalcitrant and won't make peace and defy world public opinion. It won't work. The other thing I would just point out is Israel is now on a tragic parabola, right? If you go back to 2006 in Lebanon, they were militarily defeated. They went in with 4 armored divisions. Hezbollah saw to it that they came out with 3. One whole armored division smashed up and unusable as a fighting force. That was a military defeat as well as a political one. In 2008, 2009, in the interregnum between Obama and Bush, there was this incursion to Gaza, right? Operation Cast Lead. This was a political disaster for the Israelis in the world. There was something similar about 2 years ago, and now we have this. And I think in political terms, in terms of the outcry, the horror, the revulsion against barbarity, then I think this one is very bad for the Israelis. The best advice you can give the Israelis is stop doing this. Stop generating this harvest of hate, which some way or other is going to come home to roost. And I hope that it doesn't.
We also have this just in. U.S. defense official tells CNN U.S. is resupplying Israel with certain ammunition would come from weapons stockpile U.S. keeps inside Israel. So, I mean, we can file that under, keeping anti-American sentiment alive across the Middle East and the entire world and rubbing everyone's nose in the current situation. So that's...
Well, it's an indication of the weakness of Obama. I suspect that Obama would like to find some other way out of this, but of course he's surrounded. The Republicans have unmasked themselves once and for all. The Republican Party is the party of warmongers. Any Republican, above all, any Republican president will be an absolute extremist warmonger. That was clear with Romney, for those of us who could see. But now even people like Rand Paul and company, their response to this thing has been essentially useless, right? And they're not taking a strong, uncompromising, principled stand. Filibustering. You could filibuster something like that, right? You could filibuster a military aid bill to the Israelis, but don't hold your breath waiting for the Paul family to come forward with that. Well, what you've just mentioned would be covered if you cut off the $3.1 billion. Then that flow of weaponry would also dry up. I don't see how you can keep financing aggression with those kinds of humanitarian consequences. And again, I think it would be very much to the Palestinians' advantage to let themselves be represented by the PLO. I think it's much harder for the Israelis to deal with Abu Abbas and Erekat and Hanan Ashrawi and those people who are, I think, fundamentally reasonable, whatever problems they may have. The Israelis have a much easier time dealing with Hamas because, of course, nobody in the West wants to negotiate with Hamas. Egypt, I guess, does, and Turkey does, but nobody in the West. And that means that this Hamas experiment has been a failure for the people of Gaza, right? They should be voted out. And all indications, all the public opinion polls are that Hamas would be voted out. If it came to a vote, Hamas would be out. Now, the only proviso on that is those polls were taken before the current bombing campaign, and I'm sure that the Israeli atrocities have, in some ways, increased the support for Hamas, right? It's the typical rally round effect that you see in just about every country. But and I guess that means another 2 or 3 years of Hamas. But I think it would be also important, if you're going to negotiate a peace, you can do that through the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and let Hamas be represented that way.
It's also hard to fault people that become radicalized, that are deemed a demographic threat by a country that's continually bombing them and stealing land away from them. I mean, I personally don't.
Yeah, but look, when you're taking responsibility for leading a couple of million people, right? You've got to have a policy that gets somewhere, right? You can't just act out, your sincere emotions, right? Justifiable those may be. And again, I'm pointing to this question of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and how in God's name you think you can survive against the Israelis if you don't somehow make the concessions to Egypt that are necessary to secure some kind of support from that quarter. Now, this is not just from today. I notice also that some people still think that the United States wanted General Sisi in there. They did not. Remember that Ambassador Ann Patterson, who has now been promoted to Assistant Secretary for Middle East Affairs, she was out there backing Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship at precisely the time that Morsi was proposing to attack Syria. Morsi was going to use the Egyptian army to attack Syria last summer, which was the thing that led to his overthrow. In other words, the Egyptian military said, no, we are not going to do that. We're not going to make war against Syria. You got to remember, Egypt and Syria used to be the same country. It was created by Nasser. It was called the United Arab Republic. And they had Egypt and Syria, and I think Yemen, too, for a while. And the union was not as close as that might suggest. But to unleash the Egyptian army against Syria, this would have been a horrendous thing. And you got to remember, put it all in perspective, right? The death squads backed by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United States, and NATO, they've killed, 150,000 in Syria, right? So that's several orders of magnitude beyond what we're seeing in Palestine. So it is absolutely unacceptable to have some leadership in the Middle East that says we're in favor of overthrowing Assad. And indeed, right now, the news today is that this ISIS, after having gotten their hands on all those U.S. military stocks in northern Iraq, that they've now turned around and are attacking Assad again with some effect. So that is extremely dangerous stuff. So again, what this all points to, the need for a Middle East peace conference, a Geneva conference. And if you want to see the details, there is a document. It's called the Geneva Accord. It has no official status, but it's November 2003. Yasser Abed Rabo from the Palestinian side and Yossi Beilin from the Israeli side put together what I think is the general outline of what a peace accord would look like. The only thing I would add to it again is the big stress on the Marshall Plan, because without economic reconstruction and development, no political settlement can be effective.